There is a face that never appeared at Nuremberg, a name that was never pronounced before the Allied judges, a shadow that disappeared in the ruins of Berlin while the Third Reich collapsed under Soviet bombs. His file remains open. His grave, if it even exists, holds secrets that no one has been able to decipher. He was the chief of the most fearsome secret police of the 20th century, the architect of countless disappearances, the ghost who orchestrated the persecution of millions. And yet, when the smoke cleared over the German capital in May of 1945, Heinrich Müller simply vanished. Did he die under the rubble of the Chancellery? Was he captured by the Soviets and taken to Moscow? Or did he perhaps manage to escape, like so many other Nazi criminals, to South America or some forgotten corner of the planet? After more than 8 decades, this question remains without a definitive answer. What we are going to reveal in the next few hours will change your perception of one of the most disturbing mysteries of the Second World War. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to give the video a good like and subscribe. And tell me in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who joins us from all parts of the world. Heinrich Müller was born on the 28th of April, 1900, in Munich, the capital of Bavaria, in the south of Germany. That same year, the world was entering a new century charged with promises and contradictions. The Industrial Revolution had transformed Europe. Colonial empires extended across all continents, and no one could imagine that barely 14 years later, the first great global conflagration would break out. Little Heinrich arrived in a working-class family. His father, Alois Müller, was a low-ranking police official, a minor bureaucrat in the Bavarian state apparatus. His mother, whose name rarely appears in historical records, dedicated herself to domestic chores like the majority of women of her time and social standing. Müller's childhood passed in the popular neighbourhoods of Munich, a city that in those years bustled with cultural, political and economic activity. Bavaria was a kingdom within the German Empire, with its own traditions, its deeply rooted Catholicism and its particular regional identity. Young Heinrich grew up in an austere, disciplined environment where obedience to authority was considered a fundamental virtue. His father, as a policeman, instilled in him from early on respect for institutions and the importance of public order. These values would deeply mark his personality and his future career. What kind of child was Heinrich Müller? The records of his childhood are scarce, almost non-existent. Unlike Adolf Hitler, whose youth has been scrutinized down to the last detail, Müller remains an opaque figure, even in his early years. We know that he attended primary school in Munich, that he was an applied, though not brilliant student, and that from a very young age, he showed an inclination toward methodical and organized activities. He was not a dreamer like Hitler, who fantasized about becoming an artist, nor was he a rebel or a misfit. Heinrich Müller was, from his tenderest age, a bureaucrat in the making, someone who found satisfaction in following rules, completing tasks, and fulfilling orders without questioning them. When the First World War broke out in August of 1914, Heinrich Müller was barely 14 years old. He was too young to wield a rifle, but not too young to feel the patriotic fervour that seized Germany in those days. Crowds gathered in the squares of Munich to celebrate the declaration of war. Young men enlisted en masse, convinced that victory would be swift and glorious. No one imagined that that conflict would last 4 years and cost the lives of millions of people. During the first years of the war, Müller continued his studies while observing how his older compatriots marched to the front. News arrived from the trenches of France and Belgium, from the battlefields of the East, from the seas where German submarines sank enemy ships. The propaganda of the imperial government promised a sure victory, but as the months passed, the lists of the fallen became longer and longer. The families of Munich began to dress in mourning. The shortage of food became daily. Initial enthusiasm gave way to resignation, and finally to hopelessness. In 1917, When Heinrich Müller turned 17, the situation at the front was desperate. Allied offensives had fractured the German lines. The United States had entered the war on the side of France and England. The British naval blockade was strangling the German economy. In the cities, people suffered extreme deprivation. It was in this context that young Müller made a decision that would define his life. He enlisted as a volunteer in the Imperial German Air Force. Aviation was still a relatively new military branch. The first combat planes had appeared barely a few years earlier, and the pilots were considered an elite, knights of the sky who fought in individual duels above the trenches. But Müller did not become a pilot. His role was more modest. He served as a mechanic apprentice and aerial observer, charged with identifying enemy positions from the heights. He was not a distinguished combatant, nor did he perform memorable feats. However, this military experience left a deep mark on his character. He learned to follow orders without hesitation, to function within a rigid hierarchical structure, and to value efficiency above all else. The war ended in November of 1918 with the defeat of Germany. Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated and fled to the Netherlands. The Weimar Republic was proclaimed, and Heinrich Müller, like millions of German soldiers, returned home defeated, humiliated, without clear prospects for the future. He was 18 years old, and the world he had known had collapsed. What did Müller feel in the face of defeat? Did he share the bitterness and resentment that consumed so many German veterans? Historians coincide that he did. Like many of his generation, Müller absorbed the so-called stab-in-the-back legend, the theory according to which Germany had not been defeated on the battlefield, but betrayed by internal enemies, politicians, revolutionaries, and above all, Jews. This poisoned narrative spread throughout Germany in the post-war years, feeding the anti-Semitism and extreme nationalism that would eventually lead the Nazis to power. But here arises a paradox that investigators have pointed out repeatedly. Unlike other Nazi leaders, Heinrich Müller did not join the National Socialist Party until very late. In fact, during the 1920s, when Hitler and his followers organized rallies, published propaganda, and conspired to take power, Müller worked for the Bavarian government persecuting precisely those Nazis. How is it possible that the future chief of the Gestapo began his career hunting the same men he would later serve? In 1919, at barely 19 years old, Heinrich Müller entered the Bavarian police, following in his father's footsteps. It was a time of political chaos. The Weimar Republic faced revolutionary uprisings in several cities. In Munich, communists briefly proclaimed a Bavarian Soviet Republic, which was violently crushed by the Freikorps, right-wing veteran militias. Müller witnessed these events from his position in the police. He saw how the radical left and the extremist right disputed control of the streets. And he decided that his loyalty would be with the state, with the established order, whatever its ideological sign might be. This characteristic of Müller is crucial for understanding his subsequent trajectory. He was not a convinced ideologue. He was not a fanatical anti-Semite from his youth. He was not a passionate nationalist. He was, above all, a functionary, a bureaucrat, someone who served the constituted power with implacable efficiency. His commitment was not to a cause, but to a structure. When that structure was the Weimar Republic, he persecuted Nazis. When that structure became the Third Reich, he would persecute Jews, communists, opponents, and anyone the regime pointed out as an enemy. Throughout the 1920s, Müller ascended gradually in the Bavarian police hierarchy. He specialized in the surveillance of extremist political movements, both on the left and on the right. He developed a network of informants, perfected interrogation techniques, and earned a reputation for ruthless efficiency. His superiors described him as tireless, meticulous, unscrupulous. He did not hesitate to utilize brutal methods if he considered them necessary to obtain information, nor did he show compassion for his detainees. For Müller, people were means to an end, pieces in a mechanism that he had to keep functioning. In 1929, an event occurred that perfectly illustrates Müller's mentality. The Nazi Party, still a minority force though growing, organized a series of demonstrations in Munich. Müller, as a police official in charge of political surveillance, drafted detailed reports on these activities. His documents described the Nazis as a threat to public order, a violent and subversive organization that should be controlled. Ironically, these same reports would be used years later as proof of Müller's competence, which would earn him his ascent within the Nazi repressive apparatus. Why did the Nazis recruit someone who had dedicated years to persecuting them? The answer reveals much about the nature of the Hitlerian regime. Nazi leaders were pragmatic when it came to consolidating their power. They needed capable professionals, persons with experience in police techniques, in surveillance, in repression. Heinrich Müller was exactly that, an expert in his field, willing to serve whoever was in power. His lack of deep ideological commitment was not an obstacle, but an advantage. A fanatic might let himself be carried away by his emotions. Müller, in contrast, was a cold and calculating machine who would execute any order with surgical precision. On the 30th of January, 1933, Adolf Hitler was named Chancellor of Germany. This day marked the beginning of the end of the Weimar Republic and the start of the Nazi dictatorship. In a few weeks, the new regime began to dismantle democratic institutions. The burning of the Reichstag on the 27th of February provided the pretext to suspend civil liberties. The Enabling Act, passed on the 23rd of March, granted Hitler dictatorial powers. Political parties were banned, unions dissolved, the press censored. Germany transformed into a totalitarian state with terrifying speed. During this period of consolidation, Heinrich Müller observed the events from his post in the Bavarian police. He was not yet a member of the Nazi Party. He still figured in the archives as someone who had persecuted the National Socialists, but his skills did not go unnoticed. In 1933, Reinhard Heydrich, the young and ambitious chief of the SS Security Service, began to build a repressive apparatus at the national level. He needed experienced professionals, and Heinrich Müller was one of the best available. The relationship between Müller and Heydrich is fascinating and complex. Reinhard Heydrich, nicknamed the Butcher of Prague for his later crimes in Czechoslovakia, was tall, blonde, athletic, the archetype of the Aryan ideal that Nazism propagated. He was also brilliant, ruthless, and extraordinarily ambitious. Heinrich Müller, in contrast, was short, dark-haired, with common features, physically insignificant, but he possessed something Heydrich valued enormously: an exceptional technical competence in matters of surveillance and political repression. In 1934, Müller was transferred to Berlin to work under Heydrich's orders in the Gestapo, the secret state police. This organization, whose full name was Geheime Staatspolizei, had been created barely a year earlier in Prussia and was expanding to become an instrument of repression at the national level. Heydrich saw in Müller the perfect executor for his plans, and Müller, always ready to serve the established power, accepted his new role without apparent moral conflict. It is important to stop here to reflect on this transition. How could a police official, who had persecuted Nazis, become, almost overnight, one of the pillars of the Nazi repressive apparatus? Some historians have argued that Müller simply followed orders, that he was a bureaucrat without his own convictions. Others suggest that his latent anti-Semitism finally found a legitimate way of expression under the new regime. And there are those who maintain that Müller was, above all, an opportunist, someone who served any master in order to ascend in the hierarchy. Probably all these explanations contain part of the truth. Heinrich Müller was not a monster in the traditional sense. He did not personally enjoy violence, nor did he gloat over the suffering of others. He was something perhaps more disturbing, a technocrat of evil, someone capable of administering atrocities with the same efficiency with which another would administer a factory or a post office. This banality of evil, to use Hannah Arendt's famous expression, makes figures like Müller result especially disquieting. They remind us that the great crimes of history are not always committed by evident psychopaths, but often by apparently normal people who simply do their job. Throughout the decade of the 30s, Heinrich Müller ascended rapidly within the Gestapo. In 1935, he finally joined the Nazi Party, more for practical convenience than for ideological conviction. In 1936, he was named Chief of Operations of the Gestapo, and in September of 1939, just as the Second World War began, he reached the highest post, Director of the Gestapo, Amt IV, within the Reich Security Main Office. What did it mean to be the Chief of the Gestapo? It meant controlling the most feared organization in Nazi Germany. The Gestapo was not subject to any judicial control. It could arrest any citizen without a detention order, interrogate them without time limits or restrictions on the methods employed, and send them to concentration camps without prior trial. Its agents were everywhere, in factories, in offices, in churches, in apartment blocks. Any citizen could be an informant for the Gestapo. Any conversation could be reported. Any criticism of the regime, however minimal, could result in a nocturnal visit from the feared agents dressed in civilian clothes. Under Müller's direction, the Gestapo perfected its surveillance and repression techniques. Extensive files were created with information on millions of citizens. More and more sophisticated interrogation methods were developed, combining physical violence with psychological pressure. Networks of informants were established that penetrated all strata of society. The Gestapo became the eyes and ears of the Nazi regime, an omniscient presence that generated a climate of suspicion and generalized informing. But the function of the Gestapo was not limited to internal surveillance. With the outbreak of the war and German territorial expansion, the secret police assumed a central role in occupation and extermination policies. The Einsatzgruppen, the mobile death squads that followed the Wehrmacht in its advance toward the east, operated under the coordination of the Reich Security Main Office, of which the Gestapo formed an integral part. Heinrich Müller, from his office in Berlin, supervised operations that resulted in massacres of thousands of people every day. Here we arrive at one of the darkest aspects of Müller's career, his participation in the Holocaust. Although he was not the one who designed the extermination policies, those decisions came from Hitler, Himmler, and Heydrich. Müller was one of the principal executors. His signature appears on innumerable documents related to the deportation of Jews to the death camps. He coordinated the logistics of transport, ensuring that the trains departed on time and arrived at their destination. He supervised the capture of Jews in occupied territories. In summary, Heinrich Müller was an essential piece in the machinery of genocide. On the 20th of January 1942, the infamous Wannsee Conference was held, where high-ranking Nazi officials coordinated the details of the final solution, the plan for the systematic extermination of European Jews. Heinrich Müller was present at that meeting, seated at the table next to Reinhard Heydrich and other architects of the Holocaust. The minutes of the conference, which survived the war, document how these bureaucrats coldly discussed the murder of millions of people while drinking coffee and cognac in a luxurious villa by the lake. What went through Müller's mind during that meeting? He left no personal testimony, no diary, no letter revealing his intimate thoughts. Unlike other Nazi hierarchs who wrote memoirs or were interrogated extensively after the war, Müller took his secrets to the grave, if indeed he is in a grave. Everything we know about him comes from testimonies of third parties, from official documents, from the declarations of his subordinates and victims. Müller himself remains an opaque figure, an enigma wrapped in silence. What we do know is that, under his direction, the Gestapo intensified its operations as the war advanced. Raids against Jews became more frequent and brutal. Deportations accelerated. Interrogations became more savage. Müller demanded results from his subordinates and tolerated no excuses. In occupied territories, his agents hunted resistance members, hidden Jews, anyone who represented a threat to the regime, Thousands of people were tortured in Gestapo basements across Europe. Many died during interrogations. Others were sent to concentration camps, from where they never returned. As the war dragged on and defeats accumulated, the Nazi regime's paranoia increased exponentially. After the attempt against Hitler on the 20th of July 1944, when a group of officers conspired to assassinate the Führer, the Gestapo received the order to carry out a massive purge. Heinrich Müller personally supervised the investigation that led to the execution of more than 5,000 people, including generals, diplomats, and aristocrats. The methods employed were especially cruel. Many of the condemned were hanged with piano wire, their executions filmed for Hitler's macabre pleasure. This episode reveals another facet of Müller, his absolute loyalty to the regime, or more precisely, to established power. While other Nazi hierarchs began to look for escape routes or to probe contacts with the Allies, Müller stood firm until the end. There is no evidence that he ever considered betraying Hitler or negotiating his surrender. His commitment to the system he served was total, even though that system was condemned to destruction. In the final months of the war, while Allied armies advanced from the west and the Soviets from the east, the situation in Berlin became increasingly desperate. Aerial bombardments had reduced a large part of the city to rubble. The civilian population lived in basements and air raid shelters. The supply of food and water had been interrupted, and yet the Nazi repressive machinery kept functioning. The Gestapo continued hunting enemies of the regime, now principally deserters, defeatists, and anyone who expressed doubts about the final victory. Heinrich Müller remained in Berlin until the final days, while others fled toward the south of Germany, toward Austria, toward any place far from the Soviet advance. He stayed at his post. Why? Some historians suggest that he was convinced that Germany could still win, or at least negotiate a favourable peace. Others believe he simply fulfilled his duty until the end, like the perfect bureaucrat he had always been. And there are those who suspect that Müller had a plan, that his permanence in Berlin was part of a strategy to disappear when the opportune moment arrived. On the 29th of April, 1945, a day before Hitler's suicide, Heinrich Müller was seen for the last time in a confirmed manner. He was in the Chancellery bunker, the subterranean refuge where the Führer spent his last days. Testimonies of survivors describe him as calm, efficient, busy burning compromising documents. He showed no signs of panic or desperation. He was simply doing his job, as always. What happened next? Here begins the mystery that has fascinated historians, Nazi hunters, and conspiracy theorists for more than 8 decades. According to the official version, Heinrich Müller died in Berlin at the beginning of May 1945. His body was supposedly buried in a municipal cemetery, along with other corpses collected from the streets of the devastated capital. In 1963, German authorities exhumed a common grave where his remains were believed to be. They found several skeletons, but none could be positively identified as Müller's. The investigation was closed without definitive conclusions. This uncertainty has fed innumerable theories about the real fate of Heinrich Müller. Did he really die in Berlin? Or did he manage to escape, like so many other Nazi criminals who fled to South America, to the Middle East, to remote places where they reinvented their identities and lived until an advanced age? Let's explore the main hypotheses that have been proposed over the years. Each one has its defenders and detractors, its evidences and its gaps. None has been proven conclusively. The case of Heinrich Müller remains open. The first hypothesis, the most accepted by academic historians, holds that Müller died in Berlin during the final days of the war. According to this version, the Gestapo chief would have perished in the street fighting that took place when Soviet troops entered the city, or perhaps he committed suicide to avoid falling into enemy hands. Defenders of this theory point out that Müller had every reason to take his own life. He knew that the Soviets would have no mercy on the chief of the Nazi secret police, and he probably preferred death to capture. There are testimonies supporting this hypothesis. Several bunker survivors declared after the war that Müller had expressed his intention to commit suicide rather than surrender. One of them, the pilot Hans Bauer, claimed that Müller had told him, "I have not the slightest intention of falling into Russian hands." Another witness, Hitler's bodyguard Heinz Linder, recalled having seen Müller for the last time on the 1st of May, a few hours after the Führer's suicide. However, there are significant problems with this hypothesis. None of these testimonies provides direct evidence of Müller's death. No one saw his corpse. No one witnessed his suicide. No one can confirm that he effectively died. The supposed place of burial was never verified conclusively, and the remains exhumed in 1963 could not be identified with certainty. The second hypothesis, much more controversial, suggests that Heinrich Müller was captured by the Soviets and taken to Moscow. According to this theory, the Gestapo chief would have been an asset too valuable for Soviet intelligence services to let die. Müller possessed invaluable information about Gestapo operations, about undercover agents, about spy networks throughout Europe. The Soviets, in full transition toward the Cold War, would have had enormous incentives to capture him alive. This hypothesis gained strength in the 70s and 80s, when several researchers claimed to have found evidence that Müller had worked for the Soviet Union after the war. Some even suggested that Müller had been an undercover Soviet agent for years, which would explain why he was never captured by the Western Allies. According to this version, the Gestapo chief would have provided information to Moscow in exchange for protection and a new identity. How plausible is this theory? There are certain indications that support it. Soviet archives, partially declassified after the fall of the Soviet Union, reveal an obsessive interest on the part of Soviet intelligence in capturing Müller. The NKVD, precursor to the KGB, received explicit orders to search for him among prisoners and corpses. The fact that they never reported having found him could mean two things. Either Müller really died without being identified, or he was captured and his fate was kept secret. There also exists the testimony of a Soviet defector, a former KGB officer, who claimed in the 80s that Müller had been taken to Moscow and had collaborated with the Soviets until his natural death in the 70s. This testimony could never be verified independently, and many historians consider it unreliable. However, neither has it been definitively refuted. The third hypothesis, perhaps the most sensationalist, proposes that Heinrich Müller escaped to South America, as other notorious Nazi criminals did. Adolf Eichmann, the logistical architect of the Holocaust, lived in Argentina until 1960, when he was captured by the Israeli Mossad. Josef Mengele, the Auschwitz doctor responsible for atrocious experiments, died in Brazil in 1979, without having been brought to justice. Why couldn't Müller have followed a similar route? Defenders of this theory point out that Nazi escape networks, known as ratlines, were well organised and counted on the support of sympathisers in various countries, including sectors of the Catholic Church and Latin American governments. Müller, with his connections and his knowledge of covert operations, would have been in an ideal position to take advantage of these networks. Furthermore, his face was relatively unknown to the general public, which would have facilitated his disappearance. Throughout the years, multiple reports of sightings of Müller have emerged in diverse Latin American countries: Argentina, Chile, Paraguay, Bolivia. All these countries harboured communities of Nazi exiles, and all have been mentioned as possible refuges for the Gestapo chief. However, none of these sightings has been confirmed. Investigators who have followed these leads have found at best circumstantial evidence, at worst simple rumours without foundation. A particularly intriguing variant of this hypothesis suggests that Müller not only escaped to South America, but was subsequently recruited by the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States. During the Cold War, the CIA effectively hired numerous former Nazis as agents and consultants, valuing their anti-communist experience above their war crimes. Could Müller have been one of them? This theory is based in part on a book published in 2007 by Gregory Douglas, who claimed to have had access to secret documents demonstrating Muller's collaboration with the CIA. According to Douglas, the Gestapo chief had escaped Berlin with American help, had established himself in Washington under a false identity, and had provided valuable information on Soviet operations until his death in 1982. Douglas even published supposed transcripts of conversations with Muller. However, this theory has been widely discredited. The documents presented by Douglas have been exposed as forgeries. Multiple experts have pointed out inconsistencies and historical errors in his claims. The CIA has categorically denied any relationship with Muller, and the academic community considers Douglas's book as a work of fiction disguised as historical investigation. There exists a fourth hypothesis, less known but no less intriguing, which proposes that Heinrich Müller found refuge in the Arab world. During the Cold War, several Middle Eastern countries, particularly Egypt and Syria, welcomed ex-Nazis who offered their services as military and intelligence advisors. Alois Brunner, one of the main officials responsible for Jewish deportations, lived in Syria until his death, presumably in 2010. Could Müller have followed a similar path? This theory has a certain geopolitical logic. Arab regimes of the time were in conflict with Israel and looked favourably upon the experience of ex-Nazis in matters of military organisation and population control. Müller, with his knowledge of repressive techniques, would have been a valuable asset for any authoritarian government. However, there is no concrete evidence linking Müller to any Arab country, and this hypothesis remains in the realm of speculation. Which of these theories is correct? The truth is that, after more than 8 decades, we continue without knowing for certain. Heinrich Müller achieved something that very few Nazi criminals managed: to disappear completely, without leaving a trace, without being captured, judged, or identified post-mortem. His case is unique among the Third Reich hierarchs. This disappearance raises disturbing questions. How is it possible that the head of one of the most documented organizations in history could vanish without leaving a footprint? What secrets did he take with him? And what does this say about the limits of justice when faced with crimes of such magnitude? To attempt to answer these questions, we must examine more closely the final days of Heinrich Müller in Berlin. The testimonies of bunker survivors, although contradictory in some details, allow us to partially reconstruct the movement of the Gestapo chief during the final hours of the Third Reich. What do you think of the content? Do you like this type of video? Then comment the phrase, "I want more stories." That way you will encourage us to bring more historical topics, and you will also help the video's engagement, okay? Also, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and leave your like so YouTube continues recommending our videos to you. The Chancellery Bunker, known as the Führer Bunker, was a subterranean structure located under the garden of the Reich Chancellery in the centre of Berlin. Built in 2 phases, in 1936 and 1943, it consisted of 2 sections: the upper bunker, relatively superficial, and the lower bunker, situated some 8 metres underground. This latter one was Hitler's personal refuge, where he spent the final weeks of his life and where he finally committed suicide. Heinrich Müller did not reside permanently in the bunker, but visited it frequently during the final months of the war. As chief of the Gestapo, he was one of the few officials with direct access to Hitler. His visits had multiple purposes: to report on the internal security situation, receive orders related to the persecution of traitors and deserters, and coordinate measures of repression that intensified as the regime crumbled. In April of 1945, the situation in the bunker was increasingly desperate. The Red Army had surrounded Berlin and was advancing toward the centre of the city. Soviet artillery bombardments made the walls of the subterranean refuge tremble. Communications with the outside had become intermittent, and the bunker's inhabitants, a mixture of officials, military personnel, secretaries, and service staff, lived in a state of extreme tension, knowing that the end was approaching. During these days, Heinrich Müller showed himself remarkably serene, according to the testimonies of those who saw him. While others despaired, drank in excess, or contemplated suicide, Müller maintained his habitual composure. He continued working methodically, burning documents, issuing orders, coordinating the final operations of the Gestapo. It was as if he did not really believe that everything was lost, or as if he already had a plan for the moment the bunker doors opened to the enemy. On the 29th of April, Hitler and Eva Braun contracted marriage in a brief civil ceremony inside the bunker. That same night, the Führer dictated his political testament, in which he blamed the Jews for the war and ordered the Germans to continue the fight against the poisoner of all nations. Heinrich Müller was present during part of these events, although his exact role is not clear. The following day, April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler committed suicide with a gunshot to the head, next to Eva Braun, who had ingested a cyanide capsule. Their bodies were taken to the Chancellery Garden and burned, according to instructions Hitler had left. The news spread rapidly through the bunker, provoking diverse reactions. Some cried, others got drunk, some tried to escape, others took their own lives. Where was Heinrich Müller when Hitler died? Testimonies are contradictory. Some survivors claim he was in the bunker, supervising the destruction of documents. Others say he had gone up to the surface to coordinate the Chancellery defences, and there are those who maintain he had already abandoned the area, heading toward an unknown destination. What we do know is that Müller was seen on the 1st of May, the day after Hitler's suicide. The most cited testimony comes from Heinz Linder, the Führer's valet, who declared that Müller was in the bunker that morning, still busy destroying evidence. According to Linder, Müller seemed calm and controlled, showing no signs of panic before the imminent arrival of the Soviets. After that date, testimonies become confused and inconsistent. Some claim that Müller attempted to escape from the bunker together with other officials, but was killed in street fighting. Others say he managed to leave Berlin and head west, toward Allied lines. And there are those who maintain he remained in the city, hiding among the civilian population until he could organise his escape. A particularly intriguing testimony comes from Walter Schellenberg, the chief of the SS Foreign Intelligence Service. Schellenberg, who was captured by the Allies and cooperated extensively with interrogators, declared that Müller had established contacts with the Soviets since before the end of the war. According to Schellenberg, Müller had maintained communication with NKVD agents and planned to defect to the Soviet side when the opportune moment arrived. This testimony must be taken with caution. Schellenberg had his own interest in diverting attention from his own crimes, and could have exaggerated or invented details about Müller. However, his declaration coincides with other indications suggesting that the Gestapo chief was not simply an obedient bureaucrat, but someone playing a much more complex game. Is it possible that Heinrich Müller, the Nazi official who had persecuted communists for years, was actually an undercover Soviet agent? The idea seems absurd at first glance, but the history of espionage is full of equally improbable cases. Soviet intelligence services were known for their ability to recruit agents in high-level positions, often through blackmail, bribery, or appealing to hidden ideological sympathies. If Müller was indeed a Soviet agent, this would explain several anomalies in his behaviour. It would explain why he remained in Berlin until the end, when he could have fled west like so many others. It would explain his serenity during the final days, his apparent lack of concern for his own fate, and it would explain, above all, his complete disappearance after the war, without any Western intelligence service managing to locate him. However, there are also arguments against this theory. If the Soviets had captured Müller, why wouldn't they have exhibited him as a war trophy, as they did with other important Nazi prisoners? Why would they have kept his capture secret for decades? And if Müller had been a Soviet agent all along, why is there no evidence of it in the partially declassified archives of the Soviet era? These questions have no satisfactory answers. The case of Heinrich Müller remains an enigma that defies all conventional explanations. Before continuing to explore the theories about his disappearance, we must better understand who Heinrich Müller really was. Beyond his role as Gestapo chief, what kind of person was he? What motivations drove him? And what can we infer about his character from his documented actions? Testimonies of those who knew him paint a consistent, though not particularly illuminating, portrait. Müller was described as cold, efficient, meticulous, lacking humour and visible emotions. He did not cultivate personal friendships, nor show interest in activities outside his work. He was a workaholic before the term existed, someone who dedicated practically all his time to his police functions. Physically, Müller was unimpressive, of average height, robust build, common features, dark hair and piercing eyes. He did not have Heydrich's imposing presence, nor Himmler's sinister charisma. In a crowd, he would have gone completely unnoticed. This physical anonymity was perhaps one of his greatest advantages when the moment to disappear arrived. Müller was married to Sophie Dischner, with whom he had 2 children, a son and a daughter. Very little is known about his family life. Testimonies suggest he was a distant father, absorbed by his work, who spent little time at home. His wife and children survived the war and lived the rest of their lives in Germany, apparently without any subsequent contact with him. If Müller effectively escaped, he abandoned his family without looking back. What did Müller think about the crimes he supervised? This is perhaps the most difficult question to answer, given that he left no personal testimonies. Unlike other Nazi hierarchs, who wrote memoirs, diaries, or letters where they expressed their thoughts, Müller kept absolute silence. Everything we know comes from indirect sources. Some of his subordinates declared after the war that Müller was a convinced anti-Semite, who genuinely believed in the necessity of eliminating the Jews of Europe. Others described him as a technocrat without real convictions, someone who executed orders without questioning them or reflecting on their morality. And there are those who suggested that Müller was simply an opportunist, someone who served power for personal benefit without loyalty to any cause. Probably all these characterizations contain some truth. Müller was a complex, contradictory character who resisted simple categorizations. He was capable of supervising the murder of millions of people with bureaucratic efficiency, but also of occasionally protecting specific individuals when it suited him. He was loyal to the Nazi regime, but at the same time maintained contacts with the enemies of that regime. He was a work fanatic, but also someone who knew when to abandon ship. This complexity makes the mystery of his disappearance even more intriguing. An ideological fanatic probably would have died fighting, or would have committed suicide rather than surrender. A coward would have fled long before the situation became desperate, but Müller did neither of the two things. He remained at his post until the last moment and then simply disappeared, as if he had evaporated into thin air. To understand how he could achieve this disappearance, we must examine the specific circumstances of the last days of the war in Berlin. The chaos that reigned in the German capital during the first weeks of May 1945 created unique conditions that would have facilitated the escape of anyone with adequate resources and contacts. When Soviet troops entered Berlin, they found a city in ruins. Allied bombardments had destroyed a large part of the infrastructure. Street fighting had reduced entire neighborhoods to rubble. Corpses lay in the streets uncollected. Basic services, water, electricity, and gas had stopped functioning. The terrified civilian population hid in basements and air raid shelters. In this chaos, the identification of individuals was practically impossible. Identity documents had lost all value. Photographs of wanted war criminals were not widely disseminated, and the confusion was such that thousands of people, soldiers, officials, civilians, could move through the city without being detected. The Soviets, although victorious, did not have the resources to effectively control millions of people in a destroyed city. Their immediate priority was securing military and political control, not pursuing specific individuals. Furthermore, many Soviet soldiers were more interested in looting and vengeance than in the orderly capture of war criminals. In these conditions, someone like Heinrich Müller would have had multiple options for escape. He could have adopted a false identity, using stolen or fabricated documents. He could have bribed Soviet or German officials controlling crossing points. He could have used the extensive networks of contacts he had developed over years at the head of the Gestapo. Or he could have resorted to secret communication channels with the Soviets that he had previously established. Let's examine more specifically the escape routes that would have been available to Müller. Historians have identified several possibilities, each with its own advantages and challenges. The northern route would have taken Müller toward the Baltic Sea, where he could have boarded one of the ships evacuating civilians and German military personnel toward Denmark or northern Germany. This route was used by thousands of people in the final days of the war, although it was extremely dangerous due to Soviet air attacks and submarines patrolling the coast. The western route would have taken Müller toward American or British lines, where he could have attempted to surrender or infiltrate among refugees. This route was attractive because the Western Allies were perceived as less brutal than the Soviets, and because the possibility existed of negotiating a deal in exchange for valuable information. The southern route would have taken Müller toward Austria or Switzerland, and from there to Italy, where Nazi escape networks, the famous Ratlands, were active. This route was used by numerous war criminals who managed to flee to South America, including Adolf Eichmann and Josef Mengele. Finally, the option to remain in Berlin and surrender or collaborate with the Soviets. This option, although seemingly suicidal, could have been viable if Müller effectively had prior contacts with Soviet intelligence and had negotiated his protection in exchange for information. We do not know which of these routes, if any, Heinrich Müller followed. Researchers have searched for evidence for decades, without finding anything conclusive. It is as if the Gestapo chief had managed to erase his trail completely, something extremely difficult, but not impossible for someone with his knowledge and resources. One of the most intriguing clues about Müller's possible fate comes from an incident that occurred in 1960. That year, agents of the Israeli Mossad captured Adolf Eichmann in Buenos Aires, Argentina. Eichmann, who had been one of Müller's main subordinates in the organization of the final solution, was taken to Israel, tried, and executed in 1962. During his trial, Eichmann made several references to Müller. He described his former boss as a cold and efficient professional, completely dedicated to his work. He also mentioned that, in the final days of the war, he had heard rumors that Müller planned to defect to the Soviets. However, Eichmann could not confirm these rumors and admitted he did not know what had really become of Müller after April 1945. Eichmann's testimony is significant for several reasons. First, it confirms that even within Müller's inner circle there was uncertainty about his plans and intentions. Second, it suggests that the possibility of Soviet collaboration was considered plausible by those who knew him. And third, it indicates that Müller maintained a level of secrecy even with his closest collaborators. After Eichmann's capture, Israeli, German, and American intelligence services intensified their efforts to locate Müller. Simon Wiesenthal, the famous Nazi hunter, included Müller on his list of most wanted war criminals. Mossad agents followed leads in multiple countries, from Argentina to Syria. But all these investigations ended in dead ends. Why was it so difficult to find Müller? There are several possible explanations. One is that he was simply dead, buried in some common grave in Berlin, and all searches were futile because they looked for someone who no longer existed. Another is that he had an extremely effective protection network, whether Soviet, American, or of another origin, which kept him hidden from international scrutiny. And a third possibility is that Müller, utilizing his vast knowledge of surveillance and counter-surveillance techniques, had managed to construct a new identity so perfect that it was virtually undetectable. In 1967, a former Gestapo officer named Wilhelm Hartl published a book where he claimed that Müller had escaped to South America with the help of American intelligence. According to Hartl, the Americans had decided to protect Müller in exchange for information on Soviet espionage operations in Europe. This claim caused a sensation at the time, but could never be verified and was categorically denied by US authorities. Hartl was a controversial figure, with his own motivations for fabricating sensationalist stories. He had been an SS intelligence officer during the war and later became a CIA informant, providing information on ex-Nazis in exchange for protection. His testimony about Müller must be evaluated with extreme caution, given his history of manipulation and his interest in diverting attention from his own crimes. However, Hartl's claim raises an uncomfortable question. To what extent were Western intelligence agencies willing to protect Nazi war criminals in exchange for their services? We know the answer is quite a lot. During the Cold War, both the CIA and British MI6 actively recruited ex-Nazis as agents, informants, and consultants. The knowledge these individuals had about Soviet tactics, communist spy networks, and covert operations was considered more valuable than their responsibility for crimes against humanity. One of the most notorious cases is that of Klaus Barbie, known as the Butcher of Lyon, for his brutality as Gestapo chief in that French city. Barbie was protected by US intelligence after the war and helped to escape to Bolivia, where he lived for decades. Under the name Klaus Altmann, he was not extradited to France until 1983, almost 4 decades after the end of the war. If the CIA was willing to protect someone like Barbie, why wouldn't they have done the same with Müller, who possessed much more valuable information about the Nazi security apparatus at a global level? This question has fueled conspiracy theories about American collaboration in Müller's escape, although no concrete evidence has been presented to back them up. Let's pass now to examine one of the most recent lines of investigation on the Müller case, the analysis of declassified Cold War files. Since the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 and the partial opening of American, German, and British intelligence archives, historians have had access to documents that shed new light on the mystery. One of the most significant discoveries comes from the archives of the Federal Intelligence Service of Germany, known as BND. These documents reveal that the BND conducted a secret investigation into Müller's whereabouts during the 50s and 60s. German investigators followed multiple leads, interviewed dozens of witnesses, and analysed sighting reports in various countries. However, their conclusions were inconclusive. They could not determine with certainty if Müller was alive or dead. The most interesting thing about these archives is what they reveal about the attitude of the German government toward the Müller case. Despite public declarations that everything possible was being done to locate Nazi war criminals, internal documents suggest a lack of urgency and even a certain resistance to investigating too deeply. Some officials expressed concern that an exhaustive investigation might expose uncomfortable connections between former Nazis and the post-war state apparatus. This ambivalence was not exclusive to Germany. In the United States, United Kingdom, and other Allied countries, there was also reluctance to pursue certain Nazi criminals who could turn out to be useful in the Cold War. Müller's case, if he had indeed been recruited by an intelligence agency, would have been particularly sensitive due to his knowledge of covert operations and his potential to cause political scandals. Soviet archives, although less accessible, also provide relevant information. Partially declassified KGB documents show that the Soviets were extremely interested in locating Müller after the war. The NKVD received direct orders to search for him among prisoners and investigate any lead on his whereabouts. Intelligence reports of the era reveal that the Soviets believed Müller could have escaped to the West and possibly been captured by the Americans. The significant thing about these Soviet documents is what they do not say. There is no record that Müller was captured, interrogated, or used as an agent by the Soviets. If he had effectively been recruited by the NKVD or KGB, one would expect to find some reference in intelligence files. The absence of such evidence suggests that either the Soviets did not capture him, or any record of his capture was destroyed or remains classified. Another source of information is the archives of the Center for Documentation on Nazism in Berlin, which contain millions of documents on the Nazi period, including personnel files of the SS and Gestapo. Heinrich Müller's file exists and has been examined by numerous researchers, but contains no information on his fate after April 1945. The last entry documents his presence in Hitler's bunker, and after that, absolute silence. Historians have also analysed testimonies collected during the Nuremberg trials and subsequent proceedings against Nazi war criminals. Several defendants mention Müller during their testimonies, providing information on his role in the Holocaust and other atrocities. However, none could offer credible information on his whereabouts after the war. One of the most detailed testimonies comes from Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, who was executed in 1947. Höss described Müller as an efficient and ruthless official who supervised Jewish deportations with bureaucratic precision. According to Höss, Müller visited Auschwitz on several occasions to inspect operations and ensure deportations were carried out as planned. He also mentioned that Müller never expressed emotions, never hesitated, never questioned orders he received or gave. What does all this tell us about Müller's escape possibilities? The answer is complex and disturbing. On one hand, chaotic conditions in Berlin in May 1945 would have facilitated the escape of anyone with adequate resources. On the other hand, the intensity of subsequent searches, carried out by multiple intelligence services over decades, makes it difficult to believe that someone could remain hidden for so long. But here comes something few researchers have adequately considered. Heinrich Müller was not just any Nazi criminal. He was the chief of the Gestapo, the master of surveillance and counter-espionage. He knew all the techniques used to track people, all the vulnerabilities of identification systems, all the methods employed by intelligence agencies to locate fugitives. If anyone could disappear without a trace, it was precisely him. Let's imagine for a moment that Müller decided to escape. What would he have needed? False identity documents, something the Gestapo manufactured routinely for its undercover agents. Money, probably in gold or foreign currency, something Nazi hierarchs had accumulated over years. Contacts abroad, people willing to provide refuge in exchange for favours or information. And above all, a meticulously crafted plan, something Müller was exceptionally prepared for by his training and experience. Historians have partially reconstructed the escape networks that other Nazi criminals utilised. The most famous was the so-called Rat Line, a system of waypoints going from Germany to Italy and from there to ports like Genoa, from where fugitives embarked for South America. This network counted on the support of Nazi sympathisers in Austria and northern Italy, as well as certain sectors of the Catholic Church, which, for ideological or humanitarian reasons, helped refugees without asking too much about their past. Did Müller use this route? There is no direct proof that he did. However, several researchers have pointed out that the efficiency with which the Rat Line operated would have been impossible without the knowledge and perhaps the collaboration of Nazi security services. Who better to know the details of this network than the chief of the Gestapo? But let's stop here to explore another, equally intriguing possibility. What if Heinrich Müller never intended to flee west or south? What if his plan was always to head east, into the arms of the Soviets? This hypothesis may seem absurd at first glance. Müller had dedicated a large part of his career to fighting communism. The Gestapo under his direction had implacably persecuted Soviet agents in Germany and occupied territories. Why would he seek refuge precisely with his declared enemies? The answer could lie in the very nature of Heinrich Müller. As we have seen, he was not a committed ideologue, but an absolute pragmatist. His loyalty was to power, not to a specific cause. When power resided in the Weimar Republic, he persecuted Nazis. When power passed to the Third Reich, he persecuted Jews and communists. Why wouldn't he serve a new master if circumstances required it? Furthermore, Müller possessed something the Soviets valued enormously: information. He knew the names of all Gestapo agents in Europe. He knew spy networks that Germany had established during the war. He knew interrogation methods, surveillance techniques, operational procedures of Western security services with which he had interacted. For Soviet intelligence in full transition toward the Cold War, this information was more valuable than gold. There exists circumstantial evidence supporting the Soviet hypothesis. Several witnesses declared after the war that Müller had expressed admiration for NKVD methods, the Soviet Secret Service. On one occasion, he supposedly commented, "The Russians know how to do things. We are still learning from them." This comment, if authentic, suggests that Müller viewed the Soviets not as ideological enemies, but as competent professionals from whom he could learn. There is also Walter Schellenberg's testimony, mentioned earlier. Schellenberg claimed Müller had established contacts with Soviet agents before the end of the war. According to his statement, Müller had provided information to the Soviets in exchange for guarantees of protection. If this is true, it would explain why Müller remained in Berlin until the last moment. He was not trapped, but waiting for his new allies. How credible is Schellenberg's testimony? As we noted before, we must be cautious. Schellenberg was a rival of Müller within the Nazi hierarchy, and could have fabricated this story to discredit him or to divert attention from his own activities. However, other indications corroborate his version, at least partially. In BND archives, the West German Intelligence Service, there exists a report dated 1952, mentioning persistent rumours about Müller's presence in the Soviet Union. According to this report, sources within the Eastern Bloc had indicated that a high-ranking former Gestapo officer was collaborating with the KGB in Moscow. The report does not identify this officer by name, but the descriptions coincide with Müller's profile. Another intriguing document comes from CIA archives, partially declassified in 1999. This document, dated 1961, analyzes the possibilities that various high-profile Nazi criminals had been captured by the Soviets. Among the names mentioned is Heinrich Müller. The analysis concludes that it cannot be ruled out that Müller is alive and working for Soviet intelligence, although it acknowledges there is no definitive evidence. What would have become of Müller if he had effectively been captured or recruited by the Soviets? Precedents are not encouraging. Other Nazi officials who fell into Soviet hands were subjected to brutal interrogations, summary trials, and in many cases, execution. Friedrich Paulus, the field marshal who surrendered at Stalingrad, was treated relatively well because he was useful for propaganda, but the majority of high-ranking German prisoners did not run the same luck. However, Müller's case would have been different. His value did not reside in his propagandistic utility, but in the information he possessed. The Soviets would have had powerful incentives to keep him alive, comfortable, and even privileged, as long as he continued providing useful information. It is possible that Müller lived his final years in some dacha on the outskirts of Moscow, surrounded by books and comforts, paying for his relative freedom with a constant flow of secrets about Western intelligence services. This image, admitted, is speculative. There is no concrete evidence that Müller lived in the Soviet Union or worked for the KGB, but the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially when dealing with Soviet archives, which remain mostly classified even decades after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Let's return now to examine the other hypotheses about Müller's fate, starting with the possibility that he simply died in Berlin, as the official version holds. The main argument in favour of this theory is its simplicity. The final days of the Battle of Berlin were apocalyptic. Soviet troops advanced street by street, building by building, while German defenders, a mixture of regular soldiers, SS members, and civilians recruited by force, tried desperately to slow their advance. Artillery fire was constant. Snipers lurked on every corner. Corpses accumulated in the streets, without anyone picking them up. In this chaos, thousands of people died without being identified. Their bodies were buried in common graves, or simply remained under the rubble of collapsed buildings. Why couldn't Heinrich Müller have been one of them? Perhaps he was hit by a stray bullet while trying to escape. Perhaps he died in a building collapse. Perhaps he committed suicide, like so many other Nazi officials who preferred death to capture. The problem with this theory is the lack of physical evidence. Unlike other Nazi hierarchs whose deaths were confirmed, such as Hitler, Goebbels, or Himmler, there is no credible testimony of anyone having seen Müller's corpse. No one witnessed his death. No one identified his body among the thousands of victims of the Battle of Berlin. In 1963, as mentioned earlier, German authorities exhumed a common grave in the Lilienthalstrasse cemetery, where Müller had supposedly been buried, along with other corpses collected from Berlin streets. The exhumation revealed several skeletons, but none could be positively identified as Müller's. Dental records did not match. Physical characteristics were inconsistent. The investigation was closed without conclusive results. What does this failure mean? Defenders of the theory of death in Berlin argue that it simply reflects the limitations of forensic science of the time and the degradation of remains after almost 2 decades underground. Skeptics, for their part, see it as evidence that Müller was never in that grave, that his supposed burial was a fiction created to close the case. In 2013, half a century after the first exhumation, a new controversy arose. A German historian named Johannes Tuchel announced he had discovered evidence that Müller's remains had been found in 1945 and buried in a common grave in the Jewish cemetery of Berlin. According to Tuchel, documents showed that a corpse identified as Heinrich Müller, chief of the Gestapo, had been recovered near the Chancellery and buried along with other victims of the fighting. This discovery generated headlines worldwide. Had the mystery finally been solved? The answer, as so many times in this case, was disappointing. When researchers tried to verify Tuchel's claim, they found the documents were ambiguous. The name Heinrich Müller was extremely common in Germany, and there was no certainty that the mentioned corpse was really that of the Gestapo chief and not some other Heinrich Müller who had died in the fighting. Furthermore, the location of the supposed burial in a Jewish cemetery raised disturbing questions. Why would the Gestapo chief, responsible for the persecution and murder of millions of Jews, have been buried in a cemetery of that community? Some suggested it was an irony of fate, a kind of involuntary poetic justice. Others saw in it evidence that the whole story was false, an attempt to close the case without real evidence. To this day, Heinrich Müller's grave, if it exists, remains unidentified. He is one of the few important Nazi hierarchs whose final resting place is completely unknown. Adolf Hitler was cremated in the Chancellery Garden, and although his remains were subsequently exhumed and destroyed by the Soviets, at least we know what happened. Heinrich Himmler committed suicide after being captured by the British, and his body was buried in a secret location. Hermann Göring poisoned himself in his Nuremberg cell, and his remains were cremated and scattered. But Müller simply disappeared, as if the earth had swallowed him. This disappearance is particularly frustrating for historians and Nazi hunters, because Müller possessed crucial information that was lost with him. As Gestapo chief, he knew the names and locations of thousands of agents, informants, and collaborators. He knew details of undercover operations that were never documented. He knew secrets about other Nazi hierarchs that could have changed our understanding of the Third Reich. All this knowledge disappeared with him, whether because he died taking it to the grave or because he shared it with new masters who kept it secret. What kind of secrets could Müller have known? Let's explore some possibilities that historians have suggested over the years. First, Müller probably knew the identity of numerous double and triple agents operating during the war. The world of espionage in World War II was extraordinarily complex, with agents working simultaneously for multiple sides, sometimes with the knowledge of their superiors and sometimes without it. The Gestapo kept detailed files on these agents, files that Müller supervised personally. If he managed to escape with part of this information, or if he memorized it before the files were destroyed, he would have possessed an invaluable resource for any intelligence service willing to protect him. Second, Müller knew details of the final solution with a depth that few others possessed. As supervisor of deportations, he received regular reports on operations in extermination camps. He knew exactly how many people had been murdered, where, when, and how. This information, though macabre, was of great interest to investigators trying to document the Holocaust. If Müller had collaborated with Allied authorities, he could have provided invaluable testimony. The fact that he never did suggests that either he died before being able to do so, or found protection with those not interested in prosecuting Nazi crimes. Third, Müller probably knew details of secret negotiations that various Nazi hierarchs attempted with the Allies in the final months of the war. Heinrich Himmler, for example, tried to negotiate a separate peace with the Western Allies behind Hitler's back. These negotiations were carried out through intermediaries, and it is almost certain the Gestapo was aware of them. What other secret contacts existed that never came to light? Müller could have answered this question. Fourth, and perhaps most intriguing, Müller could have known the location of Nazi treasures and assets hidden at the end of the war. Third Reich leaders, foreseeing defeat, hid enormous quantities of gold, artworks, jewelry, and other valuable objects in secret locations throughout Europe. Many of these treasures have never been found. As Gestapo chief, Müller would have been involved in the security of these concealment operations. If he escaped with this knowledge, he could have used this information as currency to guarantee his protection. These potential secrets make the mystery of Müller even more frustrating. It is not just the academic question of what happened to a specific war criminal. It is a void in our historical knowledge, a black hole that swallowed information that could have been invaluable for understanding one of the darkest periods of Western history. But let's stop here to consider a different question. Why do we care so much about Heinrich Müller's fate? Why has this mystery fascinated historians, journalists, and amateurs for more than 80 years? The answer has several dimensions. In the first place, there is a human need for justice and closure. Müller was responsible, directly or indirectly, for the persecution, torture, and murder of millions of people. It is deeply disturbing to think he could have escaped without facing the consequences of his crimes. The possibility that he lived comfortably in some corner of the world, while his victims and their families suffered, is an affront to our basic sense of justice. In the second place, the Müller case illustrates the limits of the international justice system when faced with crimes of such magnitude. The Nuremberg trials were a historic milestone, the first serious attempt to judge crimes against humanity at an international level. However, many important criminals escaped justice, whether because they died before being captured, because they managed to flee, or because they were protected by governments that considered them useful. Müller represents the most visible failure of this system. In the third place, Müller's mystery forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the Cold War and the moral decisions Western and Soviet governments made in their pursuit of geopolitical victory. If Müller was effectively protected by the CIA or the KGB, as some theories suggest, this implies that great powers were willing to sacrifice justice for strategic advantages. This possibility is disturbing, but cannot be ruled out given what we know about other similar cases. Finally, the Müller case fascinates us because it represents a genuine enigma, a mystery without resolution in an era where it would seem everything can be discovered and documented. We live in a world of omnipresent surveillance, global databases, technology that can track any person in any place. Yet here we have someone who disappeared more than 80 years ago and remains unfound. It is a reminder that even in our information age, some secrets remain kept. Let's examine now some of the most recent investigations that have attempted to resolve Muller's mystery, including the efforts of historians, journalists, and professional Nazi hunters. One of the most dedicated investigators of the case was Simon Wiesenthal, the famous Holocaust survivor who dedicated his life to tracking Nazi criminals. Wiesenthal included Muller on his list of most wanted criminals and followed multiple leads on his whereabouts for decades. At various moments, Wiesenthal believed he was close to finding him, only for leads to vanish. In 1967, Wiesenthal received information from a source in Latin America, claiming Muller lived in Argentina under a false name. The source provided a specific address in Buenos Aires and described the occupant as an elderly man of German origin who avoided contact with the community of Nazi expatriates. Wiesenthal transmitted this information to Argentine and Israeli authorities, but when investigators arrived at the indicated address, they found the occupant had died several months earlier. His body had been cremated and his belongings scattered. It was not possible to confirm if it was Muller or another person. This experience was typical of the frustrations faced by Nazi hunters in their search for Muller. Leads always arrived too late. Witnesses retracted or died. Evidence evaporated just when it seemed within reach. It was as if Muller, or someone protecting him, was always one step ahead of his pursuers. The Israeli Mossad also dedicated significant resources to the search for Muller, especially after the successful capture of Adolf Eichmann in 1960. Israeli agents followed leads in Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Paraguay, and other Latin American countries, where communities of Nazi exiles were known to exist. They also investigated possible connections in the Middle East, particularly in Egypt and Syria, where other Nazi criminals had found refuge. Despite these efforts, Mossad never managed to locate Muller. In their files, partially declassified in recent years, there exists a dossier on Muller containing numerous sighting reports, none of which could be verified. The file concludes with a note dated 1982 indicating that, given the time elapsed and the probable age of the subject, it is considered likely he has died of natural causes. However, this conclusion is based on assumptions, not concrete evidence. US intelligence services also attempted to locate Muller, although their motivations were different. While Mossad sought to bring him to justice, the CIA was more interested in interrogating him about his knowledge of Soviet operations. Declassified documents reveal that the CIA opened a file on Muller shortly after the war and kept its search active for decades. A particularly interesting document, dated 1954, suggests the CIA had information that Muller might be working for the Soviets. The document, written by an intelligence analyst whose name is redacted, argues that the prolonged absence of any trace of Muller in the West or Latin America suggests he could have been captured or recruited by Soviet intelligence services. The analyst recommends the CIA intensify its efforts to obtain information on Muller from sources within the Soviet bloc. Did this effort succeed? Available documents do not provide a clear answer. References exist to agent reports mentioning Muller, but the majority of these documents remain classified. What we do know is that the CIA never publicly announced having located Muller, suggesting either they failed in their search or found something they preferred to keep secret. One of the most controversial theories about Muller's fate comes from a book published in 2007 by Gregory Douglas, titled Gestapo Chief: The 1948 Interrogation of Heinrich Müller. Douglas claims Muller was captured by the Americans after the war, interrogated extensively, and subsequently recruited as a CIA consultant. According to Douglas, Muller lived in the United States under a false identity until his death in 1982. Douglas's book caused a sensation when published. It included supposed transcripts of conversations with Muller, as well as documents presumably demonstrating his collaboration with US intelligence. However, academic reception was devastating. Multiple experts pointed out inconsistencies and historical errors in the book. Documents presented as evidence were analysed and declared forgeries. The CIA categorically denied any relationship with Mueller. Today, the consensus among serious historians is that Douglas's book is a work of fiction, possibly based on fragments of real information, but elaborated with invented material. However, the persistence of this and other similar theories illustrates the lasting fascination the mystery of Mueller exerts. What can we conclude from all this? After examining available evidence, witness testimonies, declassified documents, and investigations by multiple agencies, are we closer to solving Heinrich Mueller's enigma? The honest answer is no. The mystery remains as impenetrable as ever. The main hypotheses, death in Berlin, Soviet capture, escape to South America, recruitment by the CIA, none can be proven nor refuted definitively. Heinrich Mueller's case remains open, an unclosed wound in 20th century history. But perhaps there is something we can learn from this mystery, beyond the specific question of what happened to a particular war criminal. The Mueller case teaches us about the limits of justice when faced with crimes of historical magnitude. It teaches us about morally compromised decisions governments took in the context of the Cold War. And it teaches us about the human capacity to disappear, to erase one's trail, to evade the consequences of one's acts. Heinrich Mueller was, as we have seen, an exceptional bureaucrat. He was not a charismatic leader like Hitler, nor a fanatical ideologue like Goebbels, nor an ambitious soldier like Goering. He was a functionary, someone who did his job with implacable efficiency regardless of what that job was. This banality is what makes him so disturbing. He reminds us that the great crimes of history are not always committed by obvious monsters, but often by ordinary people who simply follow orders. Political philosopher Hannah Arendt coined the expression the banality of evil to describe Adolf Eichmann, Mueller's subordinate, who was captured and tried in Jerusalem. But the expression applies equally well, perhaps even better, to Mueller himself. Here we have someone who supervised the persecution and murder of millions of people, and yet left no personal footprint, no testimony, no reflection on his acts. He was like a machine, a soulless mechanism executing the functions for which it had been programmed. This image of Mueller as a bureaucratic machine leads us to another disturbing reflection. How many Heinrich Müllers exist in our own time? How many people are willing to execute atrocious orders simply because it is their job, because it is what is expected of them, because they do not want to question their superiors? The answer, suggested by numerous psychological studies, like the famous Milgram experiment, is that the majority of us could become Mueller under appropriate circumstances. This possibility is perhaps the most terrifying of all. But let's return to the central mystery of our story. Did Heinrich Müller die in Berlin, as the official version holds, or did he manage to escape, disappearing into the shadows of history to live his final years under a false identity? Personally, and here I allow myself a speculation going beyond available evidence, I believe the most probable answer is that Mueller effectively escaped Berlin. A professional of his caliber, with his knowledge and resources, would have been capable of planning and executing a successful escape. The total absence of evidence of his death, combined with multiple indications of contacts with the Soviets, suggests he managed to leave the city and find refuge somewhere. Where? Here possibilities multiply. He could have gone to the Soviet Union, where his knowledge would have been valued. He could have fled to South America, where the community of Nazi exiles would have provided cover. He could have found refuge in some Arab country, where official anti-Semitism would have guaranteed protection. Or he could have disappeared into some forgotten corner of Europe, living under a false identity until the end of his days. Whatever his fate, it is probable Heinrich Müller died decades ago. If he survived the war, he would have been over 100 years old today, an extremely improbable age, even for someone living in the best conditions. The mystery of his disappearance is, at this point, a historical mystery more than a question of pending justice. However, the search continues. Every few years, some historian announces having found new clues about Müller's whereabouts. Each time, initial expectation gives way to disappointment when evidences turn out insufficient. It is as if Müller's ghost continues mocking his pursuers from beyond the grave or from wherever he may be. Now, let's explore an aspect of the Müller case rarely discussed: the impact of his disappearance on his victims and their families. For millions of people who suffered at the hands of the Gestapo, the fact that their chief was never brought to justice represents a wound that never completely healed. Let's imagine for a moment a Holocaust survivor. She has lost her entire family in extermination camps. She has suffered indescribable torture and humiliation. She has managed to survive against all odds and has rebuilt her life in a new country. But for decades, she reads in newspapers that those responsible for her suffering are being captured and tried, one by one, until finally she feels that some type of justice has been done. Except not everyone was captured. Except Heinrich Müller, the chief of the organization that destroyed her life, simply disappeared. He never faced a tribunal. He never heard the testimonies of his victims. He never had to answer for his crimes. This absence of closure is a form of additional injustice, a re-victimization of those who had already suffered too much. Organizations of Holocaust survivors have repeatedly expressed their frustration over the Müller case. For them, the possibility that he escaped is not a historical curiosity, but a personal affront. Every theory suggesting he lived comfortably in some distant country is like a slap to their suffering. This human dimension of the mystery is often forgotten when we discuss the case in abstract terms of evidence and theories, but it is important to remember it. Behind statistics and documents are real people whose lives were shattered by the organization Müller directed. His disappearance is not just a historical enigma, it is also a concrete injustice that affected millions of people. But Heinrich Müller's story also has other dimensions worth exploring. One is his relationship with other Nazi hierarchs, particularly with Reinhard Heydrich, his direct superior during a large part of his career. Reinhard Heydrich was, in many ways, the opposite of Müller. While Müller was short, dark-haired, and physically insignificant, Heydrich was tall, blonde, and athletic, the archetype of the Aryan ideal. While Müller was a quiet bureaucrat who avoided attention, Heydrich was ambitious, charismatic, and constantly sought to increase his power and influence. And while Müller had been a career official who adapted to Nazism for convenience, Heydrich was a true believer, an ideologue committed to the Nazi vision of the world. Despite these differences, or perhaps precisely because of them, the two formed an effective partnership. Heydrich provided the vision and ambition. Müller provided technical competence and execution capability. Together, they built a security apparatus that became one of the most feared and efficient in history. The relationship between Heydrich and Müller was strictly professional. There is no evidence they were friends or socialized outside of work. Heydrich distrusted Müller due to his past as a persecutor of Nazis, and Müller probably resented his young superior's arrogance. However, each recognized the other's utility, and they maintained a functional collaboration until Heydrich's death. Reinhard Heydrich died in June of 1942, victim of an attack perpetrated by Czech agents trained by the British. His death was a devastating blow for the Nazi security apparatus and provoked one of the most brutal reprisals of the war, the total destruction of the villages of Lidice and Ležáky, whose inhabitants were murdered or deported en masse. How did Heydrich's death affect Heinrich Müller? Testimonies suggest Müller temporarily assumed some functions of his deceased boss, although he was never officially named his successor. The new chief of the Reich Security Main Office was Ernst Kaltenbrunner, a brutal Austrian but less competent than Heydrich. Müller continued as Gestapo chief, reporting now to Kaltenbrunner, and maintained his implacable efficiency until the end of the war. It is interesting to speculate on how history would have been different had Heydrich survived. Some historians have argued Heydrich was Hitler's natural successor, and that his death deprived Nazism of its most capable leader. Others suggest Heydrich would eventually have been overthrown by his own rivals within the Nazi hierarchy. In any case, Heydrich's death significantly altered power dynamics within the regime and probably also affected Müller's position and options. Another important relationship in Müller's life was with Adolf Eichmann, the principal logistical organizer of the Holocaust. Eichmann was technically subordinate to Müller, although he operated with considerable autonomy in his functions related to Jewish deportation. The two men shared a similar bureaucratic mentality, a capacity to administer atrocities as if they were ordinary commercial operations. When Eichmann was captured and tried in Jerusalem, he provided extensive testimony on his activities during the war. Many of his statements mention Müller, whom he described as a demanding but a competent boss. Eichmann insisted he simply followed orders, that he was not personally anti-Semitic, and that his participation in the Holocaust was the result of his position in the hierarchy, rather than his personal convictions. This testimony of Eichmann raises interesting questions about the nature of moral responsibility in bureaucratic systems of oppression. If Eichmann only followed orders, what was Müller's responsibility? Who gave some of those orders? And what was the responsibility of Heydrich, Himmler, and Hitler, who established the policies Müller and Eichmann implemented? These questions have no easy answers, but are central to understanding the Holocaust and other genocides. Evil on an industrial scale requires the participation of thousands of people, from policy designers at the top to executors at the base. Everyone can argue they only did their part, that they were not personally responsible for the final result, but collectively they were responsible for millions of deaths. Heinrich Müller occupied an intermediate position in this hierarchy of responsibility. He was not the ultimate designer of genocidal policies, but neither was he a simple executor. He was a key administrator, someone who translated general directives into specific operations, who coordinated resources and personnel necessary to implement extermination. Without his competence, the Holocaust would have been less efficient, less organized, perhaps less lethal. This contribution makes him fully responsible, morally speaking, for the crimes he supervised. But let's return to the mystery of his disappearance, which remains the most fascinating aspect of Müller's history. We have examined the main theories, available evidence, investigations performed. Is there anything more we can learn? A line of investigation that has received attention in recent years is the analysis of Soviet archives. Since the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, millions of previously inaccessible documents have been declassified. Historians have found valuable information on numerous aspects of World War II and the Cold War in these files. Could they also contain the key to Müller's mystery? So far, results have been disappointing. Researchers who have searched for references to Müller in Soviet archives have found little substance. Documents exist confirming Soviet interest in capturing him, but there is no clear evidence they succeeded. Some historians have interpreted this absence as proof Müller never fell into Soviet hands. Others suggest relevant documents remain classified or were destroyed. Another potential source of information is archives of Latin American countries, where Nazi criminals supposedly took refuge. Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Paraguay, and other countries have begun declassifying documents related to Nazi presence in their territories during the post-war period. These files have revealed valuable information about the Rat Line and specific individuals who use this escape route. However, no document found so far explicitly mentions Heinrich Müller. Researchers have found references to other high-profile Nazi criminals, but the Gestapo chief remains absent. This absence could mean he was never in Latin America, or could mean his presence was carefully concealed even from official records. Modern technology has also opened new possibilities for investigation. DNA analysis, for example, could potentially identify Müller's remains if they were found. However, This would require first locating those remains and obtaining DNA samples from known relatives for comparison. So far, these efforts have produced no results. It has also been proposed to use facial recognition technology to analyze post-war photographs in search of images of Müller under false identities. This technique has been used successfully in other fugitive criminal cases, but presents significant challenges when applied to someone who disappeared more than 8 decades ago. Photographs of the era are of low quality, and Müller probably altered his appearance if he managed to escape. Despite these limitations, researchers have not abandoned the search. Every year, new books and articles are published on the Müller case. Every so often, some historian announces having found new leads, and although none of these investigations has definitively solved the mystery, each contributes small fragments of information that could eventually complete the puzzle. But perhaps we must accept the possibility that Heinrich Müller's mystery may never be completely solved. Some secrets are lost forever, swallowed by time and circumstances. Müller could have died without anyone knowing, buried under a false name in some forgotten cemetery, or he could have left instructions so his true identity would never be revealed, taking his secrets literally to the grave. This uncertainty is frustrating, but it is also part of what makes the case so fascinating. In a world where it seems everything can be discovered and documented, Heinrich Müller represents the persistent mystery, the secret that resists being revealed. His disappearance is a reminder that history does not always offer clear answers, that some enigmas remain unsolved despite our best efforts. What lessons can we extract from this story? Several, I think. First, the Müller case illustrates the importance of documentation and preservation of evidence. Many documents that could have revealed his fate were destroyed at the end of the war, whether by Nazis wanting to hide their crimes or by bombardments devastating Berlin. This loss of information is irreparable and has made the task of investigators much harder. Second, the case shows the limits of international justice when facing crimes of historical magnitude. Despite efforts of multiple countries and organizations, many Nazi criminals escaped justice, whether because they died before being captured, because they managed to flee, or because they were protected by governments that considered them useful. Müller is the most notable example of this failure, but he is not the only one. Third, Müller's story reminds us of the human capacity for bureaucratic evil, for the administration of atrocities as if they were ordinary commercial operations. This form of evil is perhaps more dangerous than passionate violence, precisely because it is more efficient, more systematic, harder to detect and resist. And fourth, Müller's mystery invites us to reflect on the meaning of justice and closure when dealing with historical crimes. For Holocaust victims and their descendants, Müller's disappearance represents an additional injustice, a wound that never completely healed. This human dimension of the case must not be forgotten when we discuss theories and evidence. Now, before concluding this first part of our investigation, let's explore some lesser-known aspects of Heinrich Müller's career that shed additional light on his personality and methods. One of these aspects is his role in the counter-espionage operation known as Red Orchestra, or Rote Kapelle. This was a Soviet spy network operating in Germany and other European countries during the war. The Gestapo, under Müller's direction, managed to dismantle a large part of this network, capturing dozens of agents and executing many of them. The operation against the Red Orchestra revealed Müller's skills as a spy hunter. He used a combination of electronic surveillance, infiltration of agents, and brutal interrogation techniques to identify and neutralize network members. His success in this operation earned him the respect of his superiors and consolidated his position as an expert in counter-espionage. But the operation also had unexpected consequences. Some captured agents were turned and used to feed disinformation to Moscow. This technique, known as radio game, allowed Germans to manipulate Soviet perceptions of German military operations. However, it also meant Müller and his men were in regular communication with Soviet intelligence services, albeit through double agents. Could this communication have laid the foundations for a more direct contact between Mueller and the Soviets? Some researchers have suggested yes. They argue Mueller, always the pragmatist, could have used channels established during the Red Orchestra operation to negotiate his own survival when it became clear Germany would lose the war. This theory is speculative, but does not lack internal logic. Mueller knew better than anyone covert communication methods. He knew how to send messages without being detected, and he had access to necessary resources to establish and maintain secret contacts. If anyone could negotiate in secret with the enemy while pretending to serve loyally, it was him. Another little-known aspect of Mueller's career is his participation in investigations subsequent to the attempt against Hitler on July 20th, 1944. As mentioned earlier, Mueller supervised the purge that followed the assassination attempt, which resulted in the execution of thousands of people, including many high-ranking German army officers. Files of these investigations, partially preserved, reveal Mueller's thoroughness. Every suspect was interrogated exhaustively. Every connection was investigated. Every possible accomplice was identified and prosecuted. The network of conspirators was unraveled with surgical precision, and its members were systematically eliminated. This operation also revealed Mueller's most ruthless side. Interrogation methods used were especially brutal, including physical and psychological torture. Some conspirators were executed in particularly cruel ways, their executions filmed for Hitler's macabre entertainment. Mueller supervised all this without showing, according to testimonies, any visible emotion. But the investigation of July 20th also raised uncomfortable questions about Mueller's loyalty. Some conspirators had occupied high-level positions in the Nazi security apparatus. Was it possible Mueller had known of the conspiracy and decided not to report it? Or even that he had secretly sympathized with the conspirators? There is no evidence Mueller was involved in the July 20th conspiracy. On the contrary, his active participation in subsequent repression suggests he was loyal to the regime, at least at that moment. However, the existence of such an extensive conspiracy within the very heart of the Nazi state raises the possibility there were other conspiracies, perhaps more successful in remaining hidden. Could Mueller have been involved in some secret conspiracy to save his own skin when it became clear the war was lost? This question remains unanswered, but is consistent with his psychological profile of an absolute pragmatist. Another aspect of Mueller's career deserving attention is his role in developing surveillance and population control techniques. Under his direction, the Gestapo perfected methods that would later be adopted and refined by authoritarian regimes around the world during the Cold War and after. These methods included creating extensive files with information on citizens, recruiting informant networks penetrating all strata of society, using interrogation techniques designed to break the psychological resistance of detainees, and coordinating large-scale surveillance operations. Mueller did not invent any of these techniques, but systematized them and took them to a level of unprecedented efficiency. The legacy of these methods extended far beyond the Third Reich. After the war, former Gestapo officials were recruited by intelligence services of various countries, including the United States, the Soviet Union, and various Latin American states. They carried with them knowledge acquired under Mueller's direction, contributing to the global spread of repressive techniques. This diffusion of Gestapo know-how is one of the most disturbing consequences of the failure to bring Mueller and his subordinates to justice. If all responsible parties had been captured and prosecuted, their knowledge would have remained documented, but would not have been actively transmitted to new repressive regimes. Instead, many found employment in post-war security apparatuses, perpetuating techniques they had developed. Was Mueller himself one of these transmitters of repressive knowledge? If he managed to escape and was recruited by some intelligence service, probably yes. His knowledge would have been invaluable for any organization interested in surveillance, interrogation, and population control techniques. This possibility makes his disappearance even more disquieting. Let's pass now to examine how Heinrich Müller's case has been represented in popular culture. Unlike other Nazi hierarchs like Hitler, Himmler, or Goering, who have been portrayed in innumerable movies, books, and TV series, Müller has remained relatively in the shadows of the collective imagination. This relative obscurity is surprising given the level of power he held and the mystery surrounding his disappearance. Why hasn't he captured the popular imagination in the same way as other Nazi criminals? One possible reason is the lack of dramatic material about his personality. The most memorable portrayals of Nazi villains in popular culture tend to focus on charismatic, eccentric, or particularly cruel figures. Hitler with his fits of rage, Goering with his extravagance and vanity, Mengele with his macabre experiments, all offer evident dramatic material. Müller, in contrast, was grey, efficient, lacking characteristics making him memorable as an individual. Another reason is precisely the uncertainty about his fate. The most satisfying stories have clear endings. Hitler's suicide in the bunker, Eichmann's capture by Mossad, Mengele's flight to South America, and eventual death by drowning. All these fates offer narrative conclusions. Müller's disappearance, in contrast, leaves the story unfinished, without the closure generally desired by audiences. However, there have been some notable representations of Müller in fiction. One of the best known is his appearance as a secondary character in the novel The Downfall by Joachim Fest, narrating the final days of the Third Reich from the perspective of those in the bunker with Hitler. The 2004 film adaptation, starring Bruno Ganz as Hitler, also includes Müller among characters appearing in bunker scenes. In these representations, Müller typically appears as a silent and efficient figure in the background, a bureaucrat continuing to do his job, while the world crumbles around him. This characterization is consistent with historical testimonies, although necessarily simplified for dramatic purposes. There have also been several novels and TV series using the mystery of Müller's disappearance as a plot element. Some of these works portray him as a survivor who managed to escape to South America, where he is pursued by Nazi hunters years after the war. Others imagine him as a Soviet agent, living a double life throughout his career. And some explore more fantastic scenarios, such as the possibility Müller had developed secret technologies or new conspiracies extending to the present. These fictional representations, although not historically accurate, reflect the lasting fascination exerted by Müller's mystery. Uncertainty about his fate creates a space for imagination, allowing writers and filmmakers to explore diverse possibilities without contradicting established facts. But beyond fiction, Heinrich Müller's case has been the subject of numerous documentaries, investigative books, and journalistic articles. These works have attempted, with greater or lesser success, to shed light on the mystery using historical investigation methods. One of the most complete works is the book by Richard Brightman and Norman Goder, Hitler's Shadow, Nazi War Criminals, US Intelligence and the Cold War, published in 2010. This book, based on declassified documents from the CIA and other US intelligence agencies, examines the relationship between former Nazis and post-war intelligence services. Although it does not resolve Müller's mystery, it provides valuable context on circumstances in which Nazi criminals could escape justice. Another important work is Johannes Tuchel's investigation, mentioned previously, claiming to have found evidence of Müller's burial in a Berlin cemetery. Although Tuchel's conclusions have been questioned, his work contributed to keeping interest alive in the case and stimulated additional investigations. Also deserving mention are efforts by organisations like the Simon Wiesenthal Centre, which have kept files of missing Nazi criminals open, including Müller's. These organisations have pressured governments to declassify relevant documents and have financed independent investigations on the whereabouts of fugitives. Despite all these efforts, Heinrich Müller's mystery remains unsolved. Every new investigation contributes fragments of information, but none has managed to provide a definitive answer. It is as if Müller, even after death, continued mocking those trying to track him. What does the future hold regarding this mystery? It is difficult to predict. On one hand, with each passing year, possibilities of finding new evidence diminish. Direct witnesses have died. Documents have deteriorated or remain classified. Memories have faded. On the other hand, investigation technologies continue improving. DNA analysis could eventually identify remains that until now could not be attributed. Digitization of archives makes documents previously practically lost in dusty basements more accessible. And gradual opening of intelligence files, both in the West and in the ancient Soviet Union, could reveal information that has remained hidden for decades. It is also possible the mystery may be solved by a stroke of luck, by the casual discovery of a document forgotten in some archive or human remains in some excavation. History is full of cases where long-standing enigmas were solved by fortuitous coincidences. But we must also contemplate the possibility that we may never know for certain what happened to Heinrich Müller. Some mysteries remain unsolved forever, and this could be one of them. Uncertainty, however frustrating, could be our only option facing this mystery that has defied historians, Nazi hunters, and intelligence services for more than 8 decades. But wait, there is something we haven't told you yet, something that completely changes the perspective on Heinrich Müller's final movements, something declassified archives reveal and very few know. According to documents from the US Army Counterintelligence Corps, evidence exists that Müller was captured by Americans in 1945. Historian George Chaloux, who worked for 28 years at the US National Archives, confirmed that military intelligence records indicate the Gestapo chief was in US custody after the war. But what happened next, according to his own words, is the million-dollar question. Do you understand the magnitude of this revelation? The most wanted Nazi criminal, the architect of countless atrocities, could have been in the hands of the Western Allies. And yet, he disappeared without trial, without condemnation, without the world knowing what became of him. The documents are disturbing in their ambiguity. Index cards exist stating Müller was under custody first in the locality of Ilmenau, and later, in December 1945, in a civilian internment camp in Altenstadt, in Upper Bavaria. The card does not indicate what happened to Müller afterward. It ends with a cryptic and provocative phrase. Case closed January 29th of 46. What does this mean? Was he released? Did he escape? Was he recruited secretly by some intelligence agency? Eli Rosenbaum from the US Department of Justice reviewed the same records and reached a different conclusion. According to him, the conclusion that Gestapo Müller was apprehended by US authorities and used by American intelligence is not supported by any credible evidence. But then, how do we explain the internment cards? How do we explain the closed case without explanation? Efraim Zuroff of the Simon Wiesenthal Center expressed his doubts about the possibility that the United States had used Müller after the war. It would be surprising if the Americans tried to use someone of Müller's stature. He was an incredibly important player in the implementation of the final solution. However, Zuroff himself admitted, "I have no proof." What happened to Müller remains, in his words, the big question mark in terms of Holocaust perpetrators. And here is where the story becomes even stranger. In July 1988, author Ian Sayer received from an anonymous individual a 427-page document, purportedly a photocopy of a US Army Counterintelligence Corps file. This dossier alleged Heinrich Müller survived the war and worked for the CIC as an intelligence advisor. Even more disturbing, the document claimed Müller had declared Hitler's death was faked using a double. Truth or elaborate forgery? Experts have debated for decades over the authenticity of this document. Many consider it a sophisticated forgery, but the question persists. Why would someone take the trouble to create such an extensive and detailed document if there wasn't at least a grain of truth somewhere? Let's go back now to the final documented days of Heinrich Müller, to better understand the circumstances of his disappearance. Müller was seen for the last time in the Führer bunker on the night of May 1st, 1945. According to Hans Bauer, Hitler's personal pilot and old friend of Müller, the latter commented at some point, "We know exactly the Russian methods. I haven't the slightest intention of being captured by the Russians." This declaration has been used to argue Müller probably committed suicide rather than falling into Soviet hands. But there is a problem with this theory. No one saw his corpse. Another testimony suggests Müller refused to leave the bunker along with the rest of Hitler's entourage, and was heard saying, "The regime has fallen and I fall too." He was seen for the last time in the company of his radio specialist, Christian A. Schultz, and while bodies of others who remained that night were recovered and identified, no one from the final group witnessed the death of Müller or Schultz. This absence of witnesses is crucial. In the chaos of the bunker's final days, where dozens of people died, surrendered, or escaped, Müller simply vanished. There is no confirmed document locating him outside the bunker after May 1st. It is as if the earth had swallowed him. A report from the Office of Strategic Services, precursor to the CIA, dated late June 1945, indicated no high-ranking Gestapo official had been captured yet, and that Müller had remained in Berlin. This information contrasted with the fate of other Gestapo personalities who fled south of Germany. Initial leads pointed in contradictory directions. In the summer of 1945, some German prisoners told US investigators Müller had been seen dead near the Reich Chancellery. Others insisted he had been captured by Soviet troops. US officials recorded hospitals, morgues, and detention centers throughout Berlin, but found no confirmed match. Among materials the US National Archives made public, there are fascinating and contradictory documents. An interview from December 1945 with a former Nazi claimed Müller escaped Berlin through a secret underground passage only he and Eichmann knew. A counterintelligence corps document from July 1946 indicated reports from the Russian zone of Berlin seemed to indicate Müller shot and killed his wife and 3 children and then committed suicide 2 days before Hitler died. See the contradiction. One document says he escaped through a secret tunnel. Another says he committed suicide with his family. Both come from allegedly reliable sources of the time. Both cannot be true simultaneously, and yet both were archived as valid possibilities. The most exhaustive investigation on Müller's whereabouts was carried out by the CIA during subsequent decades. Declassified documents reveal conclusions of this investigation, and they are as ambiguous as everything else in this case. The CIA report states, the Central Intelligence Agency and its predecessors did not know Müller's whereabouts at any moment after the war. In other words, the CIA was never in contact with Müller. The file shows an extensive search was conducted, led by the counter-espionage branch of the Office of Strategic Services, in months subsequent to Germany's surrender. In 1947, US and British agents searched the home of Müller's wartime mistress, Anna Schmid, but found nothing suggesting he was alive. With the start of the Cold War and the shift of priorities toward facing the challenge of the Soviet Union, interest in pursuing missing Nazis diminished. By then, it seemed reached the conclusion Müller was probably dead. But the story does not end there. Former SS official Walter Schellenberg subsequently affirmed Müller had deserted to the Soviets. This assertion, although never proven, fed decades of speculation about a possible collaboration between the Gestapo chief and Soviet intelligence. The CYA investigation reached a notable conclusion. There is little doubt Soviet and Czechoslovak intelligence services circulated rumours Müller had escaped to the West. To counteract accusations the Soviets had protected the criminal. There are strong indications but no proof Müller collaborated with the Soviets. There are also strong indications but no proof Müller died in Berlin. Read that last sentence again. Strong indications but no proof he collaborated with the Soviets. Strong indications but no proof. He died in Berlin. After years of investigation, the most powerful intelligence agency in the world could not determine with certainty what happened to Heinrich Müller. The CIA report adds a disturbing observation. One thing seems certain. Müller and Schultz had some special reason for entering the death trap of Berlin and remaining in the Chancellery. If their objective was to carry out a memorable and convincing suicide, they really botched it. What does this mean? What special reason could have led Müller to remain in Berlin while others fled? Was he waiting for someone, preparing something, or simply fulfilling his duty until the end, like the perfect bureaucrat he always had been? The CIA apparently remained convinced if Müller had survived the war, he was being protected within the Soviet Union. However, when the USSR collapsed in 1991 and Soviet archives were opened, no evidence emerged supporting this belief. This is one of the most baffling aspects of the case. If the Soviets had captured Müller, one would expect to find some record in their files. The Soviets were meticulous in their documentation, and yet nothing. Did they destroy the records? Are they still classified? Or simply was Müller never there? But let's stop here to explore a dimension of history rarely discussed, Operation Red Orchestra, and what it reveals about Müller's skills and his possible Soviet connections. The Red Orchestra, or Rote Kapelle, in German, was a Soviet spy network operating in Germany and other European countries during the war. This network had been extremely successful in sending sensitive political and military information to Moscow. Located in Berlin and other Western European capitals, it represented a significant threat to Reich security. Heinrich Müller was responsible for dismantling this network, and he did so with devastating efficiency. His Gestapo team managed to capture numerous agents and turn them, converting the network into a channel of disinformation, feeding false intelligence to the Soviet Union. The operation, baptized as Rote Kapelle by the Germans, was one of the biggest setbacks for Soviet intelligence of the whole war. Why is this relevant to the mystery of Müller's disappearance? For several reasons. First, it demonstrates Müller intimately knew Soviet intelligence methods. He had studied their techniques, their protocols, their vulnerabilities. This knowledge would have been invaluable for any intelligence agency, whether Soviet, American, or of another origin. Second, the Red Orchestra operation involved regular, though undercover communication between the Gestapo and Moscow. Turned agents sent messages regularly to their Soviet superiors. Müller supervised these communications. Is it possible he utilized these channels to establish personal contacts with Soviet intelligence? That he negotiated his own survival while appearing to serve the Reich loyally? This possibility, although speculative, is consistent with Müller's psychological profile as an absolute pragmatist, someone whose loyalty was to power and not a specific ideology. Third, Müller's success in the Red Orchestra operation would have earned him both respect and resentment from the Soviets. On one hand, he had inflicted significant damage to their intelligence operations. On the other, he had demonstrated a competence they could want to exploit. It is the type of ambivalence leading the Soviets to capture him and use him instead of executing him summarily. Now there exists another crucial testimony we must examine. In 1961, Polish defector Michael Goleniowski informed Western intelligence services his Soviet superiors had told him Müller had been picked up and taken to Moscow around 1950 or 1952. US investigators could not confirm this story, but neither could they refute it. Who was Goleniowski, and how reliable was his testimony? Goleniowski had been a high-ranking official of Polish intelligence before defecting to the West. He provided valuable information, leading to the identification of several Soviet spies, including George Blake in British MI6. However, he also made increasingly extravagant assertions with the passage of time, including he was actually Tsarevich Alexei Romanov, supposedly murdered along with his family in 1918. This combination of verifiable information and delirious statements makes it difficult to evaluate his testimony about Müller. Was he telling the truth about what his superiors had told him, or was it another of his fabrications? We do not know for certain. West German authorities also pursued more concrete leads. They investigated reports Müller's body had been found and buried shortly after the fall of Berlin. One account came from Walter Loeders, who said he had helped bury the body of an SS general, with Heinrich Müller's documents in a grave in the Old Jewish Cemetery of Berlin. In 1963, German authorities decided to verify this information. They opened the grave where Müller was supposedly buried. What they found was disconcerting. The grave contained remains of 2 unknown soldiers, but neither was Müller. His children, who had survived the war, subsequently removed the tombstone from the burial site. What does this finding mean? One possibility is Müller was never buried there, that Loeders' information was incorrect or deliberately false. Another possibility is remains were moved at some point between 1945 and 1963, perhaps by someone wanting to hide evidence of his death or survival. But the story of the empty grave does not end there. In 2013, Johannes Tuchel, director of the German Resistance Memorial, claimed to have finally solved the mystery. According to Tuchel, Müller's body was found in August 1945 by a work crew cleaning corpses from Berlin streets. He was buried, along with approximately 3,000 other bodies, in a common grave at the site of an old Jewish cemetery in Berlin-Mitte. There is a disturbing irony in this statement. Responsible for the persecution and deportation of countless Jews would have ended buried in a Jewish cemetery. But is it true? Tuchel was confident in having solved the mystery, but acknowledged it had not been possible to confirm if Müller is really there. This lack of confirmation is frustrating but understandable. A common grave with 3,000 bodies, buried hurriedly in post-war chaos, does not offer many possibilities for individual identification, especially after more than 60 years. Without DNA analysis, requiring samples from known relatives for comparison, it is impossible to verify if any of those remains belong to Heinrich Müller. Uncertainty about Müller's final fate has only served to feed the mysterious power the Gestapo evokes even in the present. It is as if the chief of the most feared secret police of the 20th century continued exercising his influence from the shadows, refusing to reveal his secrets even decades after his presumable death. But there is another aspect of Müller's career we must explore to understand completely who he was and why his disappearance remains so significant, his role in some of the most atrocious crimes of the Nazi regime. In 1939, when Hitler and his military chiefs sought a pretext to invade Poland, Himmler, Heydrich, and Müller orchestrated and executed a false flag project known as Operation Himmler. During one of the operations, the clandestine mission to a German radio station on the Polish border, Müller helped gather a dozen prisoners condemned from concentration camps, whom they dressed in Polish uniforms. In exchange for their participation, Müller told these prisoners they would be pardoned and freed. Instead, they were administered a lethal injection and inflicted with gunshot wounds, to appear as if they had been killed in combat during a fake attack. These incidents, particularly the staged attack on the Gleiwitz radio station, were used in Nazi propaganda to justify the invasion of Poland, the event triggering World War II. This operation reveals much about Müller's character. He was not simply a bureaucrat processing papers. He was willing to participate directly in murder and deception when circumstances required it. The promise of pardon to prisoners, knowing they would be executed, demonstrates a capacity for manipulation and cruelty going beyond simple obedience to orders. As the war advanced, Müller's role in Nazi atrocities became increasingly central. He was one of 15 participants in the Wannsee Conference of January 1942, where the final solution was planned. In a few months after that conference, the first camps with gas chambers were established in Poland. Müller was also fully informed about the Einsatzgruppen, death squads operating in Eastern Europe starting in 1941 and responsible for the murder of more than 1,300,000 Jews, as well as hundreds of thousands of other victims. From the Wannsee Conference onward, Müller played a very prominent role in orchestrating the genocide of European Jews. A large part of his work, as delegated by Himmler, focused on ensuring evidence of massive murders, was covered up by burning bodies of those murdered in camps, a task that became difficult in camps like Treblinka and Auschwitz-Birkenau, where crematoria often could not burn bodies with sufficient speed. In 1943, Müller was sent to Italy to pressure Benito Mussolini's government to cooperate in handing over its Jews for deportation. Despite seemingly counting on Mussolini's own support, Müller's efforts were not very successful. Influential Jewish figures within Italy were in contact with police and the Italian military and successfully appealed to their shared religious convictions to convince them to resist Nazi pressure. This failure in Italy is one of few setbacks known in Müller's career. It demonstrates that, despite his efficiency, there were limits to what he could achieve when facing organised resistance and reluctant allies. Also in 1943, Müller had differences with Himmler over what to do with growing evidence of a resistance network within the German state apparatus, particularly the Abwehr, the military intelligence service, and the Foreign Office. He presented Himmler firm evidence in February 1943 that Wilhelm Canaris, chief of the Abwehr, was involved with the resistance. However, Himmler ordered him to drop the case. Offended by this, Müller became an ally of Martin Bormann, chief of the Nazi Party Chancellery and main rival of Himmler. This political maneuver reveals another aspect of Müller's personality, his capacity to navigate Nazi power intrigues, changing alliances when it suited him. Another significant episode involves atomic physicist Niels Bohr, Nobel Prize winner. According to Rudolf Mildner, Danish security police official, Gestapo Chief Müller instructed him to arrest the famous atomic physicist winner of the Nobel Prize Niels Bohr at some moment in the autumn of 1943. This was probably a consequence of Bohr being half Jewish, although his scientific importance also interested officials in Berlin. Fortunately for Bohr, he was alerted by a sympathetic German woman working for the Gestapo and managed to escape across the Kattegat Strait to Sweden, along with the evacuation of Jews from Denmark. Subsequently, Mildner claimed conveniently during Allied interrogations he had disobeyed Müller's order and allowed Bohr to reach a safe place. Is this true? It is impossible to know for certain. Mildner, like many other Nazi officials after the war, had incentives to minimize his participation in crimes and exaggerate any act of disobedience or humanity. But Müller's original order, if it effectively existed, demonstrates his role in prosecuting figures of global scientific importance. Now then, after the attempt against Hitler on July 20th, 1944, when officers led by Klaus von Stauffenberg tried to assassinate the dictator in the Wolf's Lair, Müller was tasked with identifying and tracking conspirators. His office coordinated interrogations, arrests, and the rapid investigation that followed. His work contributed to the collapse of the resistance network and the arrest of thousands of individuals. This episode consolidated Müller's position as one of the most informed officials of Nazi Germany. His control over information converted him into indispensable for the collapsing regime. By early 1945, Müller had become essential for the regime's efforts to maintain order while everything crumbled around him. While Berlin prepared for the advance of Soviet forces, Müller continued directing his department from the capital. His final months in the post would take him to Hitler's bunker and the mystery still surrounding his destiny. By April 1945, Berlin collapsed under the weight of the Soviet advance. Governmental agencies evacuated, but Müller remained in the capital. As chief of the Gestapo, he believed his place was near the centre of power. Mid-April, he moved to the Führer bunker complex under the Reich Chancellery. Testimonies of bunker survivors describe Müller with an almost indifferent calm. He maintained his impeccable uniform, followed a strict office routine, and carried folders between meetings, as if the government still functioned normally. This composure amid chaos is characteristic of the Mueller we know, through historical testimonies, the perfect bureaucrat, incapable of stopping work even when the world crumbled. Various important bunker officials interacted regularly with Mueller during those final days. He was in contact with Wilhelm Mohnke, serving as bunker military commander. Mueller also interacted with Martin Bormann, on whom he depended for security assessments. According to post-war testimonies, Mueller informed Joseph Goebbels about the status of resistance groups, fearing opposition networks might try to exploit the chaos. He also monitored remaining personnel loyalty, worried about desertions as the situation worsened. After Hitler's suicide on April 30th, accounts diverge regarding what Mueller did. Some witnesses say he retired to offices near the lower bunker. Others claim he walked toward Reich Chancellery Gardens. Some suggest he inspected bodies near the exit, although these statements are inconsistent. And then silence. No confirmed document locates Mueller outside the bunker after May 1st. In a place where dozens of important figures died, surrendered, or escaped, Mueller simply vanished. What can we conclude from all this? Heinrich Mueller was much more than a simple bureaucrat. He was an active and enthusiastic participant in some of history's most horrendous crimes, from the false flag operation triggering World War II to Holocaust coordination. His footprint is on practically all regime atrocities. And yet, he never faced justice. He was never judged at Nuremberg, nor in any other tribunal. He never had to look his victims in the eyes, nor hear survivors' testimony. He simply disappeared, as if shadows he had cultivated throughout his career finally swallowed him. This impunity is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the whole story. In a world proclaiming its commitment to justice and rights, in decades following World War II, the Gestapo responsible managed to evade any form of accountability. Whether he died in Berlin or escaped towards some unknown refuge, Heinrich Müller never paid for his crimes. But there is an additional dimension of this mystery we must explore: Müller's legacy and his influence on post-war security apparatuses. As we mentioned previously, knowledge Müller accumulated during his career, surveillance techniques, interrogation methods, population control procedures, did not disappear with him. Other Gestapo officials who survived the war carried this knowledge with them when recruited by intelligence services of various countries. We know the CIA and other Western agencies actively recruited ex-Nazis during the Cold War, valuing their anti-communist experience above their responsibility for war crimes. The most notorious case is Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, protected by US intelligence and helped to escape to Bolivia, where he lived for decades, before being finally extradited to France in 1983. If the CIA was willing to protect someone like Barbie, is it really so improbable they did the same with Müller? Documents indicating he was under US custody in 1945, combined with the mysterious case closed of January 1946, suggest at least the possibility something happened that US authorities preferred to keep secret. On the other hand, the Soviet Union also actively recruited ex-Nazis considered useful. If Müller was effectively captured by the Soviets, as some theories suggest, he could have provided invaluable information on Gestapo operations, Western agent networks, and counter-espionage methods he had perfected over years. This possibility Müller worked for one of the Cold War superpowers, be it United States or Soviet Union, is disturbing but not implausible. Intelligence services of both sides repeatedly demonstrated their willingness to sacrifice moral principles for strategic advantages. An expert of Müller's caliber would have been an asset too valuable to simply execute or let escape. What would this mean for our understanding of post-war history? If Müller effectively worked for the CIA or KGB, he would have contributed to shaping surveillance and repression techniques these agencies employed for decades. His legacy would not be confined to the Nazi period, but would extend well into the Cold War and perhaps beyond. This possibility leads us to reflect on continuities between Nazi totalitarianism and practices of Cold War states. Techniques Müller perfected to control German population, mass surveillance, informant networks, psychological interrogations, were subsequently adopted and refined by regimes across the political spectrum. The Gestapo phantom persists in security agency practices to this day. But let's go back a moment to consider another fundamental question. Why do we care so much about Heinrich Müller's fate? Why has this mystery captured the imagination of historians, journalists, and general public for more than 8 decades? The answer has multiple dimensions. In the first place, there exists a deeply rooted need for justice and closure. Müller was responsible, directly or indirectly, for persecution, torture, and murder of millions of people. It is deeply disturbing to think he could have escaped without facing consequences of his crimes. For Holocaust victims and their descendants, the possibility the Gestapo chief lived comfortably in some corner of the world while they suffered aftermath of his persecution is an affront to any notion of justice. In the second place, the Müller case illustrates the limits of the international justice system when facing crimes of historical magnitude. Nuremberg trials were a milestone, the first serious attempt to judge crimes against living beings of an entire nation at international level. However, many important responsible parties escaped justice. Müller is the most visible example of this failure, but not the only one. In the third place, Müller's mystery forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about moral decisions governments took during the Cold War. If Müller was effectively protected by the CIA or KGB, as some theories suggest, this implies great powers were willing to sacrifice justice for strategic advantages. This possibility is disturbing, but consistent with what we know about other similar cases. Finally, the Müller case fascinates us because it represents a genuine enigma. In an era where it would seem everything can be discovered, we live in a world of omnipresent surveillance, global databases, technology that can track any person in any place. And yet, here is someone who disappeared more than 8 decades ago and remains unfound definitively. It is a reminder that even in our information age, some secrets remain kept. Heinrich Müller continues being, in words of investigators, the most important member of the Nazi regime whose fate remains a mystery. This unwanted distinction converts him into a unique figure in 20th century history, the criminal who disappeared, the ghost who refused to materialize before justice. What does the future hold regarding this mystery? It is difficult to predict. On one hand, with each passing year, possibilities of finding new evidence diminish. Direct witnesses have died, documents have deteriorated or remain classified, memories have vanished. On the other hand, investigation technologies continue improving. DNA analysis could eventually identify remains that until now could not be attributed. Digitization of archives makes documents previously practically lost in dusty basements more accessible, and gradual opening of intelligence archives, both in the West and in the ancient Soviet Union, could reveal information remained hidden for decades. It is also possible the mystery may be solved by a stroke of luck, by casual discovery of a document forgotten in some archive or human remains in some excavation. History is full of cases where long-standing enigmas were solved by fortuitous coincidences. But we must also contemplate the possibility we may never know with certainty what happened to Heinrich Müller. Some mysteries remain unsolved forever, and this could be one of them. Uncertainty, however frustrating, could be our only option facing this mystery that has defied historians, Nazi hunters, and intelligence services for more than 8 decades. But wait, there is something we haven't told you yet, something that completely changes the perspective on Heinrich Müller's last movements, something declassified archives reveal and very few know. According to documents from the US Army Counterintelligence Service, evidence exists Müller was captured by Americans in 1945. Historian George Chalet, who worked for 28 years in National Archives of United States, confirmed military intelligence records indicate the Gestapo chief was under US custody after the war. But what happened next, according to his own words, is the million-dollar question. Do you understand the magnitude of this revelation? The most wanted Nazi criminal, architect of innumerable atrocities, could have been in hands of Western allies, and yet disappeared without trial, without condemnation, without the world knowing what became of him. Documents are disturbing in their ambiguity. Index cards exist, stating Müller was under custody first in locality of Ilmenau, and later, in December 1945, in a civilian internment camp in Altenstadt, in Upper Bavaria. The card does not indicate what happened to Müller afterward, ends with a cryptic and provocative phrase. Case closed January 29th of 46. What does this mean? Was he released? Did he escape? Was he recruited secretly by some intelligence agency? Eli Rosenbaum, from US Department of Justice, reviewed same records and reached a different conclusion. According to him, conclusion that Gestapo Müller was apprehended by US authorities and used by American intelligence is not supported by any credible evidence. But then, how do we explain internment cards? How do we explain case closed without explanation? Ephraim Zuroff, of Simon Wiesenthal Center, expressed his doubts about possibility United States had used Müller after the war. It would be surprising if Americans tried to use someone of Müller's stature. He was an incredibly important player in implementation of Solution Final. However, Zuroff himself admitted, "I have no proof." What happened with Müller continues being, in his words, the big question mark in terms of Holocaust perpetrators. And here is where history becomes even stranger. In July 1988, author Ian Sayer received from an anonymous individual a document of 427 pages, allegedly a photocopy of a US Army Counterintelligence Corps file. This dossier alleged Heinrich Müller survived war and worked for CIC as intelligence advisor. More disturbing still, document affirmed Müller had declared Hitler's death was faked using a double. Truth or elaborated forgery? Experts have debated for decades on authenticity of this document. Many consider it a sophisticated forgery, but question persists. Why would someone take the trouble to create a document so extensive and detailed if there wasn't at least a grain of truth somewhere? Let's go back now to last documented days of Heinrich Müller to understand better circumstances of his disappearance. Müller was seen for last time in Führer Bunker, the night of May 1st, 1945. According to Hans Bahr, Hitler's personal pilot and old friend of Müller, this last one commented at some moment, "We know exactly Russian methods. I have not minimal intention of being captured by Russians." This declaration has been used to argue Müller probably committed suicide before falling in Soviet hands. But there is a problem with this theory. Nobody saw his corpse. Another testimony suggests Müller refused to abandon Bunker along with rest of Hitler's entourage, and was heard saying, "Regime has fallen," and "I fall too." Was seen for last time in company of his specialist in radio, Christian R. Schultz. And while bodies of others who remained that night were recovered and identified, nobody of final group witnessed death of Müller or Schultz. This absence of witnesses is crucial. In chaos of last days of Bunker, where dozens of people died, surrendered or escaped, Müller simply vanished. There is no confirmed document locating him outside Bunker after 1st of May. It is as if Earth had swallowed him. A report of Office of Strategic Services, precursor of CIA, dated end of June 1945, indicated no official of high rank of Gestapo had been captured yet, and that Müller had remained in Berlin. This information contrasted with destiny of other personalities of Gestapo, who fled towards south of Germany. First leads pointed in various contradictory directions. In summer of 1945, some German prisoners said to US investigators Müller had been seen dead near Reich Chancellery. Others insisted he had been captured by Soviet troops. US officials registered hospitals morgues, and centres of detention in all Berlin, but found no coincidence confirmed. Between materials US National Archives made public, there are documents fascinating and contradictory. An interview of December 1945 with an ancient Nazi affirmed Müller escaped from Berlin through a secret subterranean passage that only he and Eichmann knew. A document of Body of Counterintelligence of Army of July 1946 indicated that reports of Russian zone of Berlin seem indicate that Müller shot and killed his wife and 3 children and then committed suicide 2 days before Hitler died. Do you see contradiction? A document says he escaped by a secret tunnel. Another says he committed suicide with his family. Both come from sources supposedly reliable of epoch. Both cannot be true simultaneously. And nevertheless, both were archived as possibilities valid. The investigation most exhaustive on whereabouts of Müller was carried out by C1A during decades following war. Documents declassified reveal conclusions of this investigation and are so ambiguous as everything else in this case. Report of CYA establishes Central Agency of Intelligence and its predecessors not knew whereabouts of Müller in no moment after war. In other words, CIA never was in contact with Müller. File shows was realised to search extensive, led by branch of counter-espionage of Office of Services Strategic, in months subsequent to surrenders of Germany. In 1947, US and British agents registered House of Lover of Müller during war, Anna Schmid, but not found nothing that suggested he was alive. With start of Cold War and change of priorities towards face challenge of Soviet Union, interest in persecute Nazis disappeared diminished. For then, seemed having arrived to conclusion that Müller probably was dead. But story not ends there. Ancient official of SS Walter Schellenberg affirmed subsequently that Müller had deserted towards Soviets. This affirmation, although never proven, fed decades of speculation about a possible collaboration between Chief of Gestapo and Soviet intelligence. Investigation of CIA arrived to a conclusion notable. There are few doubts of that services of intelligence, Soviet and Czechoslovak, circulated rumours of that Müller had escaped towards West, to counteract accusations of that Soviets had protected to criminal. There are strong indications but no proof that Müller collaborated with Soviets. Also, there are strong indications but no proof that Müller died in Berlin. Read that last phrase again. Strong indications but no proof that collaborated with Soviets. Strong indications but no proof that died in Berlin. After years of investigation, Agency of Intelligence most powerful of world not could determine with certainty what happened to Heinrich Müller. Report of CIA adds an observation disturbing. A thing seems certain. Müller and Schultz had some reason special to enter in trap mortal of Berlin and remain in Chancellery. If his objective was carry out to suicide, memorable and convincing, really it ruined. What means this? What reason special could have carried to Müller to remain in Berlin while others fled? Was expecting to someone, preparing something, or simply fulfilling with his duty until the end, as bureaucrat perfect that always had been? CIA apparently remained convinced of that, if Müller had survived to war, was being protected inside of Soviet Union. However, when USSR collapsed in 1991 and archived Soviets were open, not emerged no evidence that supported this belief. This is one of aspects most disconcerting of case. If Soviets had captured Müller, would fit expect find some record in his archives. Soviets were meticulous in his documentation, and nevertheless, nothing. Did destroy registers, are still classified, or simply Müller never was there.